Imagine you're just minding your business, doing something as simple as picking up groceries. You're focused on your task, when out of nowhere, you're confronted and accused of something you didn't do. Now picture that person being an elderly woman, calm and collected, suddenly thrust into a situation she never saw coming. It's a nightmare that's about to unfold, and it's not just her day that's about to change, it's her entire life. It was an ordinary Thursday afternoon in the small town of Clearwater. Mrs. Ruby Jenkins, a warm-hearted 72-year-old, walked slowly through the aisles of her favorite local grocery store. Her silver hair was neatly tied back, and her glasses sat comfortably on the bridge of her nose. She moved with purpose, checking off items on her shopping list. Her gentle smile and polite demeanor made her a familiar face to both the staff and regular customers. But today, something was off. Mrs. Jenkins didn't notice the two young women standing in the aisle near the produce section, watching her intently. She didn't hear the quiet murmurs between them as they exchanged glances. To Ruby, everything felt normal until the sudden confrontation. A loud voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, ma'am, but we saw you take something." Ruby blinked, unsure if she had heard right. The young woman's eyes were filled with accusation, and before Ruby could respond, a store manager appeared at her side. Her heart began to race as the reality of the situation started to sink in. It wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was something much worse. Mrs. Ruby Jenkins was about to be accused of stealing. Mrs. Ruby's heart pounded as she stood frozen in the aisle, the manager's words echoing in her mind. "We saw you take something," the young woman had said. She turned slowly to face the store manager, hoping for an explanation, but all she saw were two security officers approaching her. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you," one of them said, his voice stern, as he motioned for her to step aside. Ruby's confusion grew, and the tension in her chest tightened. She had no idea what was happening. She had been nothing but a loyal customer to this store for years. I didn't take anything," Ruby stammered, her voice shaky. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of it. Was there some mistake? A mix-up? Maybe a misunderstanding? She glanced at the security officers, their serious expressions not giving her any reassurance. The second officer, a tall man, crossed his arms. "We have footage showing you putting something in your bag," he said, pulling out a tablet and tapping the screen. The image flashed up before Ruby's eyes. She saw herself, standing at the end of an aisle, looking at the shelf. "But I didn't steal anything," Ruby protested, feeling a rush of panic overwhelm her. Her hands trembled as she tried to explain herself. "I've been shopping here for years, I know the rules. I've never done anything wrong." But the officers didn't seem to care. They barely looked at her as they exchanged glances. One of them turned back to her and said coldly, "We'll need to check your bag." Ruby's mind went blank. Her mouth felt dry. She wanted to shout, to defend herself, but she couldn't find the words. It felt like the world around her had stopped. The officer moved closer, his steps heavy, and Ruby instinctively pulled her purse closer to her body. She had to protect herself. The entire situation was escalating so quickly, and no one was listening to her side. "I don't have anything in there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She felt small, helpless, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. As the officers continued to demand answers, the onlookers in the store started to notice the scene unfolding. Ruby could feel their eyes on her, and that only made everything feel worse. The heavy weight of judgment settled on her. She wasn't just accused of stealing, she was being treated like a criminal. As the officers gripped her arms tighter, Ruby's heart raced uncontrollably. The weight of their hands on her skin only made the situation feel more real, more suffocating. She tried to break free, but the officers held firm. Every step they took seemed to pull her further from her sense of reality. "Please, wait. I didn't do anything," Ruby cried out, her voice a mixture of disbelief and desperation. She felt the eyes of strangers on her, but no one spoke up. The store was eerily quiet, except for the sound of her shoes tapping against the tile floor as she was dragged away. The officer to her left, the one with the tablet, didn't acknowledge her at all. His face was cold, unreadable. He just kept walking, each step echoing through her mind like a countdown to something inevitable. Ruby tried to reach out to anyone, to make them understand, but her voice seemed to disappear in the vast space of the mall. She was being dragged through the crowded space, her thoughts spiraling, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. What was happening? How had everything gone so wrong so quickly? She hadn't taken anything. She'd only come in for a simple trip to the store, just like any other day. But now, everything had shifted. The vibrant colors of the clothing displays, the familiar sounds of the mall, the soft chatter of people around her, they all felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. Nothing felt normal anymore. Please, stop. I didn't take anything. I'm a regular customer here, Ruby pleaded once more, her voice cracking with emotion. The officers exchanged a glance, but neither of them showed any signs of slowing down. They ignored her cries, as if her words didn't matter at all. Her eyes darted around, searching for anyone who could help her, but the mall had gone eerily silent. The people nearby seemed to shrink away, not daring to intervene. Ruby felt the isolation settle in deeper, a crushing weight that squeezed her chest. The officers continued to pull her down the corridor toward the back room, where she had no idea what awaited her. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting harsh shadows that only made the moment feel colder, more unwelcoming. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible situation. What had she done wrong? Why was this happening to her? The back room door loomed ahead, and Ruby's stomach twisted in knots. She wanted to fight back, to break free from their grip, but her body felt heavy, exhausted from the emotional weight pressing down on her. The officers showed no sign of slowing. They were determined to take her to that back room, and Ruby had no idea what awaited her behind the door. She could feel herself spiraling. The more she tried to reason with them, the more the situation seemed to slip further from her control. Every step she took down the long hallway felt like it stretched on forever. Please, let me go. Ruby cried out, but her words seemed to bounce off the walls, unheard. No one responded, no one stepped forward. She was alone. As they reached the door, Ruby felt her knees weaken. She was terrified. Terrified not just because of the unknown, but because she had no idea how to make them stop. No one was listening to her. She was nothing but a target to them now, her pleas ignored, her protests dismissed. Her head swirled with confusion, her thoughts a tangled mess of questions she couldn't answer. What had happened to the calm, peaceful day she'd started with? Why were they doing this to her? As they finally pushed her into the small, windowless room, the officers didn't even pause. The door clicked shut behind her with a resounding thud. Ruby's chest tightened even more as she stood there in the dim, sterile room. She was utterly alone, and for the first time in her life, she felt completely powerless. The fear she had been holding back broke free, and tears began to well up in her eyes. She wiped them away quickly, embarrassed, trying to hold on to some shred of dignity. She wasn't a criminal. She wasn't the person they were making her out to be. The silence of the room pressed in on her. The tension in her body was unbearable, her limbs stiff from the rigid hold the officers had placed on her. She didn't know what to do next, didn't know where to turn. All she could do was stand there, waiting. Waiting for answers she didn't think she'd ever get. The officers had left her there, alone, without a word. They had stripped her of her voice, her dignity, and now she was left in this cold room, a broken woman, trying to hold on to the slivers of hope that still flickered within her. As Ruby stood there in the sterile room, the cold air pressing against her skin, a wave of desperation flooded over her. She felt trapped, isolated. But through the storm of confusion and fear, one thought stood clear in her mind, her son, Oliver. He was the only one who could help her now. With trembling hands, Ruby reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. Her fingers shook as she dialed the familiar number, praying he'd pick up. It rang twice. Then, his voice came through the line, sharp and familiar. "Mom? What's wrong?" Oliver's voice was calm, but Ruby could hear the concern underneath. Oliver, they've got me, Ruby managed to choke out, her voice cracking. They think I stole something, but I didn't. I need you, please, you've got to help me. For a moment, there was silence on the other end. Ruby could imagine her son's face, his brow furrowed in confusion, concern flooding his features. Then, she heard him speak again. Stay where you are, Mom. I'm coming. I'll be there in 5 minutes. The relief that washed over her was instant, but it didn't last long. The door opened again, and one of the officers stepped in, his eyes cold and unfazed. Ruby quickly wiped away the tears that had begun to streak down her cheeks. She didn't want to show them how vulnerable she felt, but the fear was almost suffocating. It felt like hours had passed before she finally heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching the back room. Her heart leaped in her chest. Could it be him? Just as she started to doubt, the door opened again, and Oliver stepped into the room. His presence filled the space, towering over the officers, his posture straight and firm. For a moment, it seemed like time stood still. The air grew thick with tension as Oliver's eyes met Ruby's. A flash of recognition passed between them. She was safe now. The two officers, who had been so sure of themselves only moments before, faltered. They didn't expect this. They hadn't anticipated a family member stepping in, and certainly not someone like Oliver. Oliver's gaze shifted from his mother to the officers, his expression cold, calculating. What's going on here? He demanded, his voice low and firm. The officer who had been in charge straightened up. This woman is being detained for shoplifting, he said, his tone still matter-of-fact. We have reason to believe she took something without paying. Ruby could feel the fire in Oliver's gaze as he processed the words. He knew his mother. He knew she would never do something like this. No, Oliver said firmly. My mom hasn't stolen anything. You're making a mistake. The officer didn't back down immediately. She was seen leaving the aisle with an item hidden in her bag, he insisted, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Ruby's heart was still racing, but she felt a spark of hope ignite within her. This was it. This was the moment she needed. She glanced at Oliver, silently begging him to make things right. Oliver didn't flinch. His hand reached for his wallet and pulled out his ID, placing it on the table between them. He wasn't just any bystander. He wasn't just a son trying to protect his mother. Oliver was a lawyer, and the badge he placed on the table was his ticket to dismantling everything these officers thought they knew. I'm Oliver Jenkins, he said, his voice sharp and steady. And I'll be contacting my attorney and the media if you don't release my mother immediately. The room went silent. For the first time, the officers seemed to hesitate. They glanced at each other, unsure of how to respond. They had made a mistake, and now they were caught. Oliver's reputation, his career, his connections, all of it was clear in that moment. Ruby watched, a sense of disbelief still lingering in her chest. How had things escalated this far? How had they gotten to this point where she needed her son to rescue her from something so ridiculous? One of the officers cleared his throat, but the confidence in his voice was gone. Ma'am, we apologize for the misunderstanding, he stammered. We'll be releasing you immediately. Oliver didn't let them off the hook so easily. I want this incident documented, he demanded. And I want an apology, not just from you, but from your supervisor as well. The officers glanced at each other again, no longer sure of their next move. They could sense the power shift in the room, the pressure mounting from Oliver's calm authority. With a few more words exchanged, they quickly collected their things and left the room. Ruby stood there, stunned, as the door clicked shut behind them. She was free, but her legs felt weak, her emotions drained. The rush of relief mixed with the anger and confusion of the past hours hit her all at once. She had been accused of something she didn't do, treated like a criminal, all because of a simple misunderstanding. Oliver walked up to her and wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. You're okay, Mom, he murmured, his voice soothing. She nodded against his chest, unable to find the words to express the overwhelming gratitude she felt. It had been the longest few hours of her life, but in that moment, she knew everything was going to be all right. The tension in the small room still hung heavy in the air as the officers stood frozen, trying to process what had just unfolded. Oliver's calm, authoritative presence had shifted everything. In an instant, the roles had reversed. The officers, once so sure of themselves, now found themselves unsure of what to do next. Oliver didn't wait for them to gather their thoughts. With a deep breath, he spoke again, but this time, his voice carried even more weight. "I'm Captain Oliver Jenkins, with the local police department," he said, holding up his badge for them to see. The officers blinked, their expressions flickering between confusion and realization. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't anticipated someone with the authority to expose their errors so swiftly. The sudden shift in power was undeniable. The officer who had spoken to Ruby earlier took a step back, the confidence he had held now completely evaporated. "Captain Jenkins, we didn't know," his voice trailed off, struggling to find words that could make the situation right. Oliver didn't let him finish. "I trust this situation can be resolved without further complications," he said coldly, his voice firm but not unkind. It was clear now that the officers understood the gravity of their mistake. The fear of what could happen next was evident in their eyes. They had made an error, and now they had to fix it. After a few moments of silence, the officer finally nodded. We apologize for the misunderstanding, ma'am," he said, his tone deflated. "You're free to go." Ruby, still shaken but now beginning to feel the weight lift off her shoulders, slowly stood up. Her knees were weak, but Oliver was right there beside her, steadying her. She wanted to speak, to express her relief, but the words wouldn't come. As the officers stepped aside, Ruby and Oliver left the back room, the mall's noise and bustle once again becoming overwhelming after the quiet tension of the past hours. Ruby felt a strange mix of gratitude and exhaustion. Her son had saved her from a situation that, minutes before, seemed hopeless. But even as she stepped back into the public space, she knew she would never forget this day. The injustice of it. The fear she had felt. And the way Oliver had handled it all, calm, collected, and in control. Oliver placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Let's get out of here, Mom. You're safe now." And for the first time in hours, Ruby allowed herself to breathe deeply. She was safe, and the nightmare was finally over. Her son had not just saved her from an accusation, but from the helplessness that had nearly consumed her. If you found this story shocking, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss the next twist or turn in our upcoming videos. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Did you think the officers would back down? Stay tuned for more unexpected stories like this one.